Killer dogs, China friend or foe, and the political fallout from Brexit. This is Politics Live. And joining us today, the Conservative MP and Chair of the Women and Equalities Committee, Caroline Noakes, the Labour MP Barry Gardiner, Telegraph Associate Editor Camilla Tominey, and the Observer's Sonia Soda. Now, on today's programme.
China's a fact, it's a huge country. We've got to find ways of engaging with it, and sometimes we have to be absolutely prepared to confront it.
We cannot describe China as foes. They are our fourth largest trading partner.
And an alleged spy in Parliament. Is China a threat to the UK? Also, she, her, he, him, they, them. Should school children be able to decide what they're called?
What are you playing at? Yeah.
And the chaotic politics after the UK voted for Brexit.
In the course of my political career, I have been a systematic plotter who's tried to remove the Prime Minister and eventually succeeded, and it doesn't give me any great pleasure.
And should the dog that attacked this man be banned? Right, we're going to pick up on that story about dangerous dogs. Here's the front page of The Mirror, which today is reporting that the Home Secretary is examining whether or not a breed of dog called the American Bully XL should be banned. Actually, it's a story we covered on this programme. I don't know if you remember this or not, but back earlier in the year, we spoke to Emma Whitfield. Now, Emma's son, Jack, was killed by just this kind of dog, the American Bully XL.
We never expected this to happen at all. And to go from picking him up from school to less than an hour later being told he's gone, that is something that stays with me all day, every day.
That's Emma, who's Jack Liss's mum, talking us about his death back in March of this year. Caroline notes the question she's actually asked today on social media is, why hasn't government acted sooner?
Well, I think Suella has been absolutely right to say that we have to look at this. The XL Bully isn't a breed, it's a type. And over the summer, I spent a day out with the dog warden locally, went to the pound just outside Southampton and saw these dogs there. They're not pets, they're weapons. And my view would be very clear. Look, whilst breed-specific legislation has its challenges, there are too many of these dogs on our street being kept for nefarious purposes, and they have no place. And I think Emma's absolutely right. We should crack on and tackle this problem.
Do you agree with that, Barry Gardiner? I mean, I heard Stan Rawlinson, who's a dog behaviour expert, saying on the radio this morning, it's the most dangerous dog breed I have seen.
Look, first of all, obviously, you have to sympathise with the families who have been victims of these dogs, and I would say victims of their owners. And Caroline's right, these are dogs that are used very often for nefarious purposes, and the owners are brutalising the dogs in order to make sure that they respond aggressively. If you see, in fact, the image that you've got of one of those dogs and the image that was being shown on television last night, if you look at the ears carefully, those ears have been cropped. Very often they're just taken a pair of scissors or shears to them, cropped like that, which puts the dog into real agony. I was with the EFRA Select Committee. We've been doing a report into dog smuggling and dog brutalisation, the whole issue now around canine fertility clinics, where they're breeding some of these dogs that can't breathe properly, the brachycephalics. And there is a real problem with the illegal trade that is coming in from the continent. And these dogs are often brutalised abroad. They have their ears cropped, they have their tails cropped, and they are bred in this way. And we haven't yet published the report from the EFRA Select Committee, but I can tell you it's pretty shocking reading. And I was somebody who, before, when people talked about puppy farms, I thought, oh, you know, there's got to be more serious political thing. Actually, it is awful what is going on, and this Select Committee inquiry really opened my eyes to it. But we need to do something, but I don't think it's about banning breeds, banning dogs. It's about controlling bad owners who brutalise animals who otherwise would be, you know, able to be pets in the normal way.
Dog, I
Camilla.
think it's interesting because there's this argument, isn't there, I think, that the Kennel Club puts forward, you know, don't blame the breed, blame the deed. And of course we've got to ask questions of dog owners themselves.
Yeah, but how do you ban owners?
Well, you can't ban owners, but this, I was going to move on to the point to say that this particular XL type of dog, you know, we've used the tragic case there of Jack Liss. That's one of 7 people that have been killed by that dog. You watch that footage, it's absolutely horrifying. And the thing is about this particular type of dog is once it latches on, it won't let go. You know, and I think that sometimes you speak to owners and they're like, oh, you know, they're friendly dogs. The dogs are bred to be aggressive. There's no point saying, oh, well, if you've got a border collie, then they're bred to, you know, round up sheep. If you've got a retriever, they're bred to retrieve. If you've got a pit bull,
if it's bred to be
aggressive.
Right. Well, on that basis, you have to ban it, don't you? Because
I would agree with the ban. I think these dogs shouldn't be on the streets. I wouldn't want them anywhere near my
police say the majority of cases they deal with where they're called out for a dog attack involve American Bull XLs.
I don't see, there's no reason not to ban it. I don't see what the arguments are for not doing so, but I don't think that that is mutually exclusive at all with what Barry's talking about. So absolutely, if there is a breed of dog that is dangerous, it should go on a ban list. What possible, I mean, why should people be able to own them? But that should go alongside tackling dangerous owners and these behavioural issues.
How?
Well, I'm no expert on that, but I don't think you can just ban dangerous dogs without doing the other stuff. I think you have to do both. And I think some of the issues that Barry was talking about, so you can breed dogs in order to be dangerous. So there are some breeds that are more dangerous and should be banned, but there are dogs of other breeds that can be trained to be more aggressive. And so I think you have to do both. And I suspect some of the concerns of organisations like the RSPCA, I disagree with them that I think breed-specific bans should happen, but they must not be done to the exclusion of some of the measures on owners that I think Barry was talking about.
The RSPCA, Barry, says taking a breed-focused approach is fundamentally flawed. And as Caroline said, it isn't a breed at all. Well, we've been down this route before. We tried it in the mid-90s and the law didn't work.
Exactly. Breed-focused bans don't work in that way. And Caroline's absolutely right. It's not a breed, so it'd be very difficult to ban it in that way. We have in this country an absolute burgeoning multiplication of these new canine fertility clinics. And we heard evidence from the Royal Veterinary Association that now surgical procedures are being done on dogs, even to the extent of caesarean sections being done on dogs in completely unsuitable, unregulated ways. It's against the law, but the penalty for breaking the law is £100. And actually, these dogs command prices of several £1,000s each.
Just last thought, Caroline, you were out with the dog wardens. What were they saying to you? Do they want particular kinds of dogs banned?
So we had some really interesting conversations with dog trainers, with the woman that was running the pound in Southampton and the dog warden, all saying something has to be done about the XL. And it's a question of you need effective and enforced regulation. And my view is that you should ban that breed, but also be vigilant to the fact that there is backstreet puppy farming that's putting other dogs at risk and actually putting individuals at risk from dogs with unclear behavioural traits, ripped from their mothers too early. We saw this beautiful little Cocker Spaniel bitch who had been abandoned on the streets of Hampshire next to an XL bully in the pound, completely traumatised, had a hideous life. And you just think the sort of people that mistreat animals are more than capable of mistreating other human beings.
Thank you all very much. Let's move on to China, which in a sense is the story of the day. And it's actually on the front of the Sunday Times was first broke this story. Commons worker arrested after allegedly spying for China. It says British parliamentary researcher had links to MPs. The police have confirmed, this has come from the Metropolitan Police, that this was a man in his 20s who was arrested and addressed in Edinburgh, along with a man in his 30s arrested in Oxfordshire. They were subsequently released on police bail until a date in early October. Now, we understand that Lindsay Hoyle himself, the Speaker, is going to make a statement to the House of Commons this afternoon. It'll be interesting to what he has to say. I want to start with you, Barry, because you've experienced some of this at first hand with somebody called Christine Lee who gave money to your local party or to you.
No.
You tell us exactly what happened.
Well, first of all, I received no money, obviously, but the money went to pay for workers in my office, whom I appointed. She had nothing to do with.
But
the
you ended up employing her
workers.
son, didn't you?
Yes, but that was something that had been done many years before, actually, and we'd worked together for many years. But look, the key issue here is that Christine Lee was never accused of spying.
And she denies doing any wrongdoing.
In fact, I think she's
suing MI5 or
MI5. Yeah, she was never arrested. She was, and she never had a parliamentary pass. You said connections with MPs. In this case, this person, I understand, actually had a parliamentary pass.
I want to go on to that, but just to be clear about that case, so we clear it up. What did anyone from the Intelligence Security Services say to you? Look, we're concerned about this.
No, on the contrary. I actually spoke to the security services 2 or 3 years before they broke the story, which by that stage had already been broken by the Sunday Times and the Guardian 2 years prior to that.
OK, so you'd informed them before they read about it in the papers.
I'd spoken to the security services because I knew that although she was a British citizen, or is a British citizen, she did work for the Chinese embassy in this country, and I thought that's a connection that I need to alert the security services to. So I had a number of conversations with them. They'd never said to me disengage, so it was quite a shock when they then came out and said she is an agent of influence, and as you say, she is now suing them for.
Good, you cleared that up. Caroline, this is about parliamentary researchers.
We need to look very seriously about how it was that this particular individual was able to get a parliamentary pass, because you can't get a parliamentary pass unless you go through security clearance.
Caroline Oakes.
Well, look, I think the processes that our staff go through for parliamentary clearance are quite rigorous. I know Claire, who works for me, was born in Cyprus, and it's always a complete palaver to get hers renewed. But the stark reality is that we, as members of Parliament, and indeed the parliamentary estate as a whole, has to be vigilant, has to be conscious that there will be outside actors who are seeking to gain influence and indeed information.
What is the influence they're trying to get?
Well, I don't know. I've no idea why the Chinese communists would seek to be infiltrating Barry or indeed anybody else's office.
But there is a clear reason why they might
insult you, Barry.
No, but I'm quite humble on the matter. But Tom Tugendhat and the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, they are precisely the sort of individuals.
To be fair, this was apparently before Tom Tugendhat became security minister.
It was,
when he was chairing
but he was also well known as somebody who took an interest in those security matters.
Right, let's bring in Camilla on this. What do you make of this story?
I mean, it's intriguing because before we came on air, this individual has issued a statement denying any involvement with the Chinese at all. Equally, there have been rows across the Tory party with regard to, say, quite a China-sympathetic MP called Richard Graham bringing guests into the House of Commons that the likes of Ian Duncan-Smith, who's been placed under sanctions by China, doesn't agree with. I mean, in the whole, one can see where Kemi Badenoch's coming from on this, because in order to label China a foe is probably economically not sensible for the UK. But at the same time, there is evidence mounting, isn't there? You know, China's sort of weaponisation of AI and other technologies, the overtaking of the semiconductor market, these little positions of influence that they've had cropping up across the Pacific with regard to trying to strengthen their military might. And at the end of the day, you know, after what's happened in Crimea and indeed the Ukraine, I think the very credible threat that they might invade Taiwan.
Sonia, it's interesting, isn't it, that the Prime Minister apparently had a meeting during the G20 summit in Delhi over the weekend with the Chinese Prime Minister, and says, we're told it was a business-like meeting, which probably means it was quite frosty, and it lasted only 20 minutes, but effectively we're told he was saying, not happy about, you're trying to interfere in our parliamentary democracy.
Well, I think it's not just covert attempts to interfere that we need to be worried about. The Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee produced a report recently which was incredibly critical of the government and said, yes, there's a covert stuff, but actually, if you look at the amount of influence that China now has across a number of domains, our energy infrastructure, academia and universities, IT, for example, and we saw the government pull back on Huawei, but there are other aspects of technology where there's nothing covert about it at all. There's a lot of influence that the Chinese government has got, and they were very, very critical of the government. They said the government's been very slow off the mark to recognise the threat, and that perhaps, you know, the prospect of foreign investment has proved, you know, it's sort of blinkered the government to the security issues that may come with it. And I think, like Camilla, actually, you know, whether or not China invades Taiwan, that moment...
Let's not get into that.
When Russia invaded Ukraine, that had huge ramifications for our energy security, for example. We should be learning lessons from that in relation to China.
Haven't we already done that? I mean, we're saying Huawei isn't going to be allowed to be involved in our telecommunications.
But that's one decision, right? And it's one decision that got very scrutinised. As Parliament, as MPs in Parliament have pointed out, there's a whole range of other decisions, including, actually, you know, universities being incredibly lax about the Chinese government monitoring Chinese students at British universities, where we're not just not...
Let me say some of the things that do trouble me here. And I think, of course, all countries want to know what other countries are doing. We all, let's face it, we also will have our intelligence gathering in other countries. But the point I would make is this. What is going on with our security services? First of all, that these people are able to get in there in the first place. And as I say, the key thing here for me is that this was somebody with a parliamentary pass who was actually working, known to be working, on an area of sensitivity about China. Actually was controlling the all-party group, as I understand it, in relation to China there. Now,
although we've heard that, you know, the statement he's put out saying I have done nothing wrong.
But why is it that the security services arrested somebody in March and now in September we're finding out about it? I mean, you know, Shaun, that on the day the story broke about Christine Lee, I went straight onto the media, I spoke about it, I answered questions from the public about it. We've heard nothing about this. Why is it now that the security services have released this information?
Caroline, do you have a view on that? Because, I mean, you could say, we know, for example, that Foreign Secretary James Cleverly went to Beijing last month, met senior leaders. We don't know whether this was raised. I mean, as
and we know that the Prime Minister was going to be meeting the Prime Minister of China at the G20. Right, so it's very strategic to have done it at this moment.
But I don't think we're in a position where we're saying cut off ties with China. I think it's absolutely right that the Prime Minister meets with the Chinese. It's right that James Cleverly does as well. Barry just made an interesting point, though, that this chap was, in his words, controlling the all-party parliamentary group. That's absolutely why there have to be tighter controls on those groups. There are new rules coming in March, I think, restricting the numbers of APPGs we can be officers of. But the real question is that who's funding the APPGs? Not, you know, is Bloggs the chairman of it, but actually who's providing the secretariat and what controls and restrictions are there on that?
You're using jargon that lots of people won't be aware of. These are all-party parliamentary groups. Yeah. MPs choose whether or not they become involved with them. They're on issues or they might be on a country. You're concerned about if there's enough clarity, enough... You can see who's providing the money and who's involved with them.
This individual was controlling a group of MPs. That's absolutely wrong. It should be the MPs who should be in control of those all-party groups. They should be the ones setting the agenda, the direction of travel, what they're interested in. And I get very concerned at the prospect of some shady lobbyist even controlling them.
I think Caroline's right. So we know that some of these groups are funded essentially by lobby interests, by people who've got a particular
interest. We've always known
that,
haven't we?
Yeah, absolutely. But there is a lack of transparency about how they're funded. Quite frankly, I mean, to some extent, why should they even be allowed to exist in some ways? You know, if it's there are people
and there are
with
dozens and dozens and dozens of them.
They're very hard to keep track of, and it doesn't feel fair, actually, that if you've got a lot of money and you've got an interest in shaping legislation that comes out of the House of Commons, you just set up one of these groups and channel a load of money in, offer to pay for some researchers for MPs, and, you know, Bob's your uncle.
Camilla.
Also, the environment has changed since the days of sort of Osborne and Cameron being very, you know, welcoming to the Chinese, because we now know about the Uyghurs, we now know about the treatment of people in Hong Kong. You know, so all of our diplomatic relations, of course, are based on economic concerns, but, you know, there are human rights abuses have been taking place and are still taking place.
I'll give you a quick anecdote at this point. I was on the trip with George Osborne when he was then Chancellor, and Boris Johnson, then Mayor of London, and David Willits, who was then Senior Minister. And I know for a fact the ministers were told to leave their phones at home because just concerns that maybe. So even in that golden age, as I think David Cameron called it, relations, people in government need to be a little bit cautious. Last question to all of you. I'd be interested on this. Rishi Sunak is hosting a summit on AI out of all places, Bletchley Park, where they cracked the codes of the Germans during the Second World War. Should the Chinese now be uninvited, Sonia?
I mean, I don't. Yeah, I think I don't see what's to be gained by having them in the room.
Camilla?
Yeah, I'd say disinvite them pending an investigation into this spying scandal.
Carol?
Yeah, I think we need to understand exactly what has happened here before we can be extending warm invitations to the Chinese.
Barry?
My understanding is that the Chinese are ahead of the rest of the world on AI, and maybe we should do a bit of spying on them and find out what they know that we don't.
But would you ban them from this event?
I think at the moment it would be politic to say, look, until this is cleared up, you are disinvited.
Now, I don't know if that's a first on this programme, but unanimity from the Politics Live panel. I'm not sure we're going to get it on this next subject because this is a subject that apparently even the government can't agree on. This is the headline in The Times, you may remember from last week. Rishi Sunak to block ban on pupils changing gender presentation. Just to be clear about what we're talking about here. This is whether individual school pupils should be able to say to their head teacher, to the school, henceforward, I don't care what it says on my birth certificate. I want you to call me... I'm a girl on the birth certificate. I want you to call me he, him. Or I'm a boy on the birth certificate. I want you to call me she or her. And, of course, it extends beyond just the naming. It's also about how other pupils refer to them. It's also about whether then they take part in team sports according to the gender they were born with or the gender they identify with. I mean, it is a real hot topic of conversation. The reports now, Caroline Oates, as chair of the Women's Equalities Committee, is that the government has decided it's not going to do anything on this. Tell us what's happening.
Well, so I've certainly been in roundtables with Gillian Keegan, the Education Secretary, and colleagues talking on this very issue. I will give you my view, having spoken to numerous head teachers in my constituency over the course of the last few years. This isn't a problem of the last few months, but it's been developing for years. Head teachers want to support young people in their schools, in the classroom, and indeed outside it. And I think it's absolutely imperative that we understand that young people who are going through a social transition need help and assistance. They need, the head teachers, need clear guidance from government. And it now looks like they're not going to get clarity. And I think that's the biggest problem, is that we'll carry on with a piecemeal head teachers having to decide on a case-by-case basis as they go along. And actually, when it comes to gender transition, maybe that's the best thing, that head teachers, those expert professionals who have worked with young people all their careers, get to make the decisions.
I'm kind of like thinking carefully about how to speak about this subject, because if certain sectors of society don't agree with you, you can suddenly find yourself being abused and cancelled, in the case of Roisin Murphy or J.K. Rowling or anyone else. My personal opinion is I think that biological sex is immutable. Having said that, if children do have gender dysphoria, dysmorphia, and they feel that they want to be referred to by other pronouns, I don't...
Because basically they feel they were born in the wrong body.
Yeah, I don't agree with the biological premise of any of it. But what I disagree with is the idea that children can say to teachers behind their parents' back that they want to be known by different pronouns and the parents not find out. I also disagree with teachers being fired because they have misgendered pupils, when often, because of the lack of guidance, and I covered a story in this nature, it was so sensitive and people were treading on such eggshells that it wasn't properly communicated. Another teacher said to this teacher, oh, I think she wants to be known as a he. This teacher had religious beliefs, didn't really believe in any of it, didn't know how to communicate with that pupil. The whole thing's in a mess. He then gets fired. You know, again and again, we try and have these conversations and debate is shut down because there are extremists on the fringes of the argument not wanting to have the debate as we are at this table.
Do you want to respond on that?
No, so look, I'm not an extremist. I agree with a lot of what Camilla has said, and often when people are misgendered, that is done wholly by accident and through confusion. And I do it, and I know I do it, and I always say when I'm talking to trans people, I am very sorry, right at the outset, I'm very sorry if I get any of this wrong, because we're all learning more about it as every single day passes.
But you're dealing with adults. This is dealing with kids.
Yeah, and so I've written a lot about this issue, and I think you have to take the heat out of it. I disagree with Caroline, actually. I think schools are crying out for guidance on this issue. It's very important they get it, because it's a very complex issue, and it should be determined by two things. It should be determined by the best medical evidence on social transition and what discrimination law says as well. And on the medical evidence, and it's all about child wellbeing, it shouldn't be about ideology. On the medical evidence, we've had a very important independent review by a distinguished paediatrician, Hilary Cass. She looked at social transition. She said it's not a neutral intervention. It can have long-term impacts on children and young people in terms of their psychological functioning.
So when you say it's not a neutral intervention, in other words, actually making that choice to decide what
she says it should be done in conjunction with clinical professionals, not head teachers, because it can make medical transition more likely, and we know from the medical evidence that gender dysphoria, so the feeling that you were born a boy but you may be a girl or vice versa, we know that in the majority of children and young people that resolves itself through adolescence. If you socially transition children and young people, Hilary Cass is worried, and many other medical professionals, that you make it set in a way that it wouldn't otherwise, with long-term consequences. Yes. So that is very important. The second thing you have to be, so it should be mental health professionals taking this decision in conjunction with parents. It absolutely should not be schools. We know there are cases where it's been done by schools without parents being informed, without parental consent. That is terrible. The other thing we have to be very careful of is there is discrimination legislation that establishes the right of all children in schools. The Equalities Act. So schools have to provide genuinely single-sex toilets, changing facilities. Girls have the rights to access single-sex sports at schools.
I want to come on to those questions in a minute. Just on the principle of it. We've got an article, I think, which I think we can put up, actually. This is by Catherine Burble-Singh, who obviously is a head teacher, quite a well-known public figure as well. She was briefly the government's social mobility advisor, saying, look, I'm a head teacher and we're crying out for guidance. If the government's going to say, actually, there isn't going to be any guidance, having promised guidance, it's very frustrating for head teachers, and potentially they're legally exposed.
Well, I think it's very frustrating for head teachers, but equally there simply isn't the access to the clinicians and the mental health professionals that young people are crying out for. And that, I think, is one of the real challenges that the government has. We have a crisis of mental health in our schools already, and this is adding to it, clearly adding to it.
Having said that, Caroline, young people reached out to clinicians at the Tavistock, and Hilary Cass's review, and indeed Hannah Barnes's extremely, comprehensive book about that scandal, said that, they reached for puberty blockers without actually analysing what these children were going through, the mental health challenges that they faced, and whether actually being on puberty blockers and transitioning fully into adulthood would be something they came to bitterly regret. And I think there's this sense, particularly among parents, that there's been so much slide that the decision-making has almost been left to the children. And that shouldn't be right, because we're all in a safeguarding position to say to children, you might feel this right now. It could, by the way, be a phase. This is the other thing, somebody presents that they want to be a different gender. Suddenly it's taken as gospel that everybody must protect. These children might just be confused.
What if the parent says, I want this to happen?
Well, if the the child is the centre of this whole thing. But what I'm
saying, if the parent says, I'm ultimately responsible for this child, and I want you to treat my child as a different gender.
Without the child wanting them to be treated as a different gender.
I don't know, but all I'm saying is, should the parent ultimately have the last word?
I think a holistic approach needs to be taken by some of the professionals that Sonia's been talking about. But at the moment, what I'm saying is, it seems to be, well, the child has decided this, so let's all go along with it, because if we don't, we might be cancelled.
Barry, you sat very quietly through all of this. You must have a view.
I do. I believe that there is sex and there is gender, and they are different. I learnt that when I read The Female Eunuch, when my mother gave it to me on my 14th birthday. And you have to not pretend that they're the same thing. It is really important, though, that when anyone does experience gender dysphoria, that we are in exactly the sort of mindset that Caroline has been talking about, listening, understanding, trying to support. And I entirely agree with you that it must always be with the parents' involvement. No school should be taking simply the child's decision here, but if the parent is involved, then the important thing for that child is that both the school and the parent are supportive of their decision.
OK. Caroline, just before we move on, there are also reports in today's newspapers that the government is delaying further the outcome of the sex education review, which arguably affects almost every child in schools unless parents choose to keep them out of sex education. It's another area where schools really need government help, don't they?
And I find it fascinating that we will all be arguing for better, more relevant relationship and sex education when it comes to protecting young girls from misogyny, when it comes to making sure that our children are well educated around drugs, around the challenges of social media. We'll all say it in the household, there needs to be more information on vaping, etc. And yet when it comes to issues around transgender challenges in schools, then suddenly we're terrified to even go ahead with the RSHE review. Look, I think that it's absolutely imperative that we have good quality, well delivered, preferably by specialist teachers of RSHE in our schools, because we have young people growing up in an environment that is so different to that which any of us would have experienced, and they're finding it challenging.
So relationship and sex education, got to be absolutely clear. Good. Thank you all very much. Now, we haven't talked a lot about the B word in the last couple of years or so, but it's sort of back. It's back tonight on BBC Two at 9 o'clock. The documentary is by Laura Koonsberg, late of this parish, as they say, who, of course, was the BBC's political editor during that critical period. The programme is called State of Chaos. It's not about Brexit itself by any means. It's about what followed in terms of the political arguments and the chaos, indeed meltdown, that occurred at Westminster. Let's take a look.
It is undoubtedly the case that in the course of my political career, I have been a systematic plotter who's tried to remove the Prime Minister and eventually succeeded. And that doesn't give me any great pleasure, but it's too bashful to pretend otherwise.
It felt like a political war. No deal, no agreement, anger everywhere. MPs couldn't agree inside, the two camps boiled over outside. We looked on, trying to understand. It felt alien, sometimes unsafe.
In a moment, I will take interventions. What are you playing at? What are you doing? You are not children in the playground. You are legislators. As I said in the letter,
I don't regret it. I mean, I was trying to inject into the House a sense that we needed to take responsibility for this really complicated problem. But I was also becoming by then increasingly troubled by the real prospect that Brexit would be lost completely.
Well, Laura Koonsberg, who has presented that programme, is joining us now from Glasgow. Laura, lovely to see you again. You were, forgive the expression, you were in the thick of it during this time. So you knew a lot of this stuff before that may come as a surprise. But what were the surprises for you?
I think when you go back, Shaun, as we have done through that whole period, we start in 2016, the first episode on tonight, and we go all the way up to 2022. One thing that came across to me so strongly was how traumatic it was for many of the people involved, just how intense it was, just how difficult it was, and actually also just how painful I think it was for a lot of people. And I say that because a lot of the interviews we've done, we spoke to dozens and dozens of people for this film. A lot of people ended up, in tears, or said afterwards, oh my God, you know what? That was sort of like a period of therapy. And I think for viewers who remember us covering it at the time, night after night, seeing screaming crowds outside Westminster, or those of us who were working in and around Westminster and Whitehall at that time and remembering how high the stakes were, how upset people were, I think it really surprised me to go back and relive some of those moments, because maybe participants, observers had sort of been pushing that down. It was so visceral and so awful a lot of the time, and sadly also for a lot of the MPs involved, really, really dangerous. In 2016, if an MP had talked about having a death threat, that would have felt pretty unusual. By the end of that period, I'm sad to say, it felt really pretty common.
Laura, stay with us, because we've got some of the participants and observers here in the studio, like you, all involved in this process. Sonia, it must bring back memories whenever people start talking about this period. Let's be honest now, with cards on the table, did you know what was going on?
What do you mean in terms of what was going to happen in the result?
After the referendum, in that period afterwards, in those 2 or 3 years afterwards when the government was trying to deliver Brexit, did you really know what was going on?
Well, to be honest, I found the parliamentary twists and turns that actually everyone in the Westminster Village got quite obsessed with in some ways. I think it was very difficult for people to understand in the outside world exactly what was going on and what a particular shenanigan meant. So it is funny looking back and reflecting on it, because it does feel like a period actually where Westminster was a little bit self-obsessed in some ways with what was going on inside it. Yeah, surely not, exactly. But, you know, I feel like now we're getting more distance from Brexit. We're in a better position to step back and properly evaluate what it means for us as a country. And, you know, I'm afraid to say that, you know, some people might say, well, you would say this because you were a Remainer pre-2016. The Observer's editorial line was very much in favour of staying in. But for me, you know, the warnings about how it was going to make us all poorer have come to pass. It's going to increase regional inequality.
Let's not go into refighting Brexit, for goodness sake, because that will take the next 10 minutes to probe. Camilla, was it as difficult a period to report on as Laura's talking about?
I don't know whether Laura agrees. I mean, it was an emotional period to report on, but it was also exhilarating. And the hours that we were putting in, you know, it created this kind of false environment where just being in Westminster till midnight, reporting and chopping and changing on the front page, and oh my goodness, this has happened, and what's happened next? It kind of became the norm for a period.
So it's lousy for people's families.
It was crazy, actually. Laura will probably remember this, because I remember when we finally got to 2019 and Brexit had been, in inverted commas, done, and then we had the Johnson administration and the sort of annihilation of Corbyn. We were all at this Downing Street drinks party. I remember it vividly. All of the journalists were saying, thank God for that. God, we've got a period of peace and quiet. Things will go back to normal. 3 months later, COVID happened. So, I mean, it was just... I think what was unfortunate about it is what happened during the Brexit and Remain sort of debates was that people lost the ability to disagree.
I'm going to ask politicians that. I just want to bring Laura back in. Laura, because there's something in the documentary which sort of captures this. When you got William Hague, who is known for being witty and all the rest of it, very articulate, he just says, this is the new normal. And he doesn't say it with a smile.
No, he says it was the end of normal.
The end of normal.
And I think that I think, as Camilla says, that period, which is the first episode of the documentary, people did lose. They lost the plot and they lost the ability to have polite disagreements. And the referendum campaign had cracked the Tory party open in that way. And, you know, the irony of all of this, of course, is that David Cameron had tried to have that vote to settle the argument. Actually, it poured a whole load of petrol on a fire that then sort of burnt almost out of control and, you know, threatened to take the whole Tory party with it. And I think that loss of being able to have rational debate, because the Brexit debate was so much about identity, that then stayed with us as a problem throughout what came next, through the pandemic, through then how to do sort of, you know, rational, normal politics. And I think that kind of went, you know, that genie really went out of the bottle. And I think that's something that stays with us to some extent. And those grudges and rivalries and a bit of identity crisis also in the Tory party too right now is partly down to that. But also there is something else I think that all of the political parties live with through this whole period. And, you know, we go all the way up to and end with Liz Truss at the end of the third episode. There is a sense that politics, and I don't know if Caroline or Barry would agree with this, that after all of that period when our viewers and voters saw politicians consumed in these arguments with each other, after that, there's a real challenge for politicians to prove to the public that actually they're in it for the right reasons, and actually that they can be a positive force for change. And you can sort of trace, you know, the mess of that with Theresa May trying to hold things together with a traditional broad church Conservative Party. It doesn't work. Boris Johnson then picks a side to get Brexit done, as he would have said. But if you weren't on side, you were basically an enemy. Liz Truss then ends up turning on the orthodoxy, as she calls it, and relying on a sort of small tribe of her own party, which, of course, then completely explodes. So I think you can trace this sort of acceleration of that kind of politics. And that's been one of the really interesting things going back and, you know, looking at how cracked all of those chains were. one of the really important elements, though, too, is how things got really toxic between Whitehall and Westminster, and we absolutely are still seeing that play out at the moment.
Yeah, I want to talk about that in a moment. But Caroline Oakes, I mean, you were kind of part of this process because at one point you ceased to be a Conservative MP for about 7 weeks. I think.
Yeah, you know, I went from being a cabinet minister to a non-Conservative in a space of a few weeks. Look, it was a really toxic, horrible time. I've never forgotten. And bearing in mind, I was someone who voted for a deal endlessly. Having a couple of elderly gentlemen scream at me in the marketplace in Romsey. I just want you to imagine Romsey's marketplace. It is beautiful, historic, genteel. Having two men scream at me that I was a traitor who deserved to be shot. And people just got so angry. And I think even all these years on...
Are there colleagues who still don't speak to each other at Westminster, would you say?
I think that there were friendships that were broken forever.
For good.
I don't know that we don't speak to each other, but certainly there would have been people who I fell out with over Brexit who I'd have counted as really good friends, and now I don't spend any time with whatsoever. And I think it's really sad. But in the wider country as well, you see people are really angry still. And I think the comment that we've forgotten how to disagree well is absolutely bang on.
I hate to remind people of difficult times, but since that's what we're talking about, here's a headline from The Guardian. Labour says MP backs its Brexit policy. It's about you, Barry Gardiner. What did you call... Can you remember what you called the policy back in 2018?
Yes, I can.
You can use the word. It's
good.
Children at school.
No, I said that you can't leave a club and still expect to get the same membership rights as somebody who's a member of the club. And I said that test was bollocks. And it is bollocks, and everybody knows it, and we found out that it's bollocks.
But was that the consequence of what was going on?
The government was saying at the time that they could do that. Labour's position should have been, that's a stupid thing to promise people, but we'll hold you to it. And instead, I'm afraid the Labour Party took it on board and said, yeah, we can do that too.
That would be... So one Sir Keir Starmer is now the leader of the party.
I want to answer your question.
Very briefly.
Because you asked the question, did we really know what was going on? Boris Johnson...
Yes or no?
Boris Johnson, when he was the Foreign Secretary, one of the three people who was supposed to be in charge of Brexit, stopped me in the corridor one day in New Palace Yard, and he said, Barry, I just published an article in The Guardian, actually, about the customs union and about a customs union and the Turkish customs union and the different asymmetries and exactly how it could be. And Boris said, tell me, what is all this stuff about a customs union? And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, what is a customs union? I can say that now because he's no longer an MP. I wouldn't have said it when he was an MP because it was a private conversation. But he did not know, as the Foreign Secretary, what a customs union was. And that explains why we got into the problems that we then got into with Northern Ireland.
Should just say that one of the other things that features in Laura's programme is this revelation that Sir Simon MacDonald, who is the top man at the Foreign Office, told everybody, he's a civil servant, that he'd actually voted against Brexit.
On this occasion, this solitary occasion, I decided to tell my colleagues, and therefore let ministers know, that I had voted to remain in the European Union. I felt that they would assume that in any case, so I decided to embrace it.
Sir Simon MacDonald, a civil servant saying, Caroline Oakes, how he voted in an issue of this controversy. Was it a wise thing to do?
I think it probably wasn't wise, but it's actually quite refreshing, isn't it? People telling you the truth about what they've actually done.
Laura, you're still there with us. Was this striking to you? Very briefly.
Oh, I just fell off my chair. I mean, I couldn't believe that he would say that on the record. He explained the reasons why he thought this was the exception. And if you like, actually, that whole thing is a symbol of how one of the problems with Brexit is people saw that debate as the exception, and then they didn't follow the normal rules on any side.
Camilla, very quickly, should he have done it?
No.
No. OK, that's it. We end on disagreement. Certainly no chaos here. Joe's back tomorrow with more Politics Live.